So I just finished this book, Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. Finished it today, in fact, and had been kind of stewing on some thoughts about the book. And I was thinking, I might be interested in sharing some of these thoughts. I'm going to go ahead and get to the end and see. And now that I've finished it, the ending actually kind of compelled me even more to kind of talk a little bit about the book. And what I would like to share is some analysis. Not so much kind of like a plot analysis as an analysis of where Lincoln and the Bardo kind of fits into Western literary tradition and where it kind of fits in the conversation about some of the important thematic material that Mr. Saunders has chosen to tackle in this book. I mean, it's a super ambitious book. I mean, when you think about what he decided to write about and how he approached it, it's ambitious formally, and it's ambitious because it's a work of historical fiction, and specifically the stuff that he picked to do the historical work around. A lot of people have a lot of thoughts about Abraham Lincoln and about the Civil War. I don't know if this is still the case, but I've heard it said a lot that Abraham Lincoln is the American who's had the most books written about him. I imagine that's probably still true. He's definitely probably like up there. I mean, he's definitely up there as one of the most popular Americans. He's maybe the most popular American historical figure. And the Civil War is a huge historical topic that lots of people who even aren't necessarily all that interested in history or politics have some thoughts about. So, deciding that you're going to write and use that as your thematic material, it's a little bit of a tall task. So there's some ambition there. But then I think, to me, an even more ambitious thing is to decide you're going to write a worldview book, and specifically to write one where you're kind of intentionally at times putting some Eastern ideas and some Western ideas kind of like in tension with each other. And they're not totally in tension because you don't necessarily see like arguments between views of the world, but just the fact that you've got kind of like Christian elements to some of the worldview topics that get brought up. And then you also have some very self-consciously Eastern elements too. I mean, one good one is the title. I didn't know what the word Bardo meant, what that was, prior to reading the book. But yeah, that's a word that comes from Buddhism. And so you've got kind of like an intentional pairing of some Western and Eastern stuff. And that's a little bit of again, kind of like an ambitious thing to do. Part of why it's ambitious, and this will be part of the conversation about how to find a place for Lincoln and the Bardo in the Western literary tradition. But part of why that's ambitious is because I would have to think that the most significantly talked about thing in all literary traditions is kind of like worldview stuff, cosmological and metaphysical topics that try to deal with the big questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What is this universe that I am in? What's my relationship with this universe supposed to be? Is there any meaning? If there is meaning, where does it come from? What is it? Those are the issues that have been occupying people for as long as we've had self-conscious thought. And since that there's been so much thinking around those issues, that thinking has become very, very mature. And so if you're going to write a book where you're going to kind of spend a lot of time dealing with some of those issues, it's going to be a little bit of a job if you're going to try to say things that are new, unique, and maybe unconventional. Because every time you do that, you're going to have to figure out how to make that statement in the context of all this other stuff that most of your readers are going to already have some familiarity with. Plus, just like in a song or a poem, if you're going to repeat a word, if you don't intentionally change the meaning of the word when you repeat it, you're wasting your breath and you're wasting your reader's time. Similarly, when you're writing something that's on a topic that has been discussed lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. If you're going to say something on that topic, especially if you're going to try to say something that's a little bit new, inventive, a little bit different than what's been said before, you better deliver with something that feels like it's worth saying or worth hearing. Otherwise, again, you're kind of wasting your own time and you're wasting your reader's time. So if, Thomas Aquinas or Mahatma Gandhi or somebody else said it better than you, then whenever you say a weaker version of whatever their thing was, or a less interesting or less compelling version of it, then, what are we even doing here? So that's kind of part of the ambition and the conceit that's involved in picking something like that as your thematic material. So with that being said, I wanted to just take a quick diversion and talk about two kind of like elements or two types of legacy. And I'll use some examples from popular culture as a way to describe a dynamic that you can see in literary legacy. So I want to talk about kind of the relationship between the predecessor and the successor. And I want to talk about maybe one version of it where the passing of the baton is not super successful, and then a second example that tries to kind of describe what it looks like when it is successful. So for the less successful version, recently on HBO, there was this TV series called Succession. And one of the big, elements of that show was the relationship between Logan Roy, who's the patriarch of the family, and his son Kendall Roy, who is the child, the one of his 4 children, who's the most actively involved in the empire that Logan has built. And in that story, just, quick and dirty summary, basically, Logan, the weight of Logan's legacy kind of like overwhelms and eventually kind of buries Kendall. And so Kendall is not able to kind of like successfully take the mantle of Logan and continue to grow the legacy of the family. That's an unsuccessful passing of the torch. An example of a successful passing of the torch that comes to mind for me is from Henry Bolingbroke to Prince Hal. So Henry IV to Henry V in Shakespeare's historical plays. And Henry IV was, had a colorful history, but ultimately was a more or less successful ruler and politician. And then he had a son, though, who initially looked like he was not on track to being a successful successor. Was kind of like a playboy, didn't take life really seriously, was kind of running away from his responsibilities. But ultimately then, through a series of events, does ultimately step into the role, does well, and grows with the role. And I think what you see then is a situation that's kind of like the ideal that hopefully everybody who's got an interest in legacy would hope for, and that is that the predecessor builds a legacy that is honorable and worthy of continuance. But then the successor says, I'm going to kind of embody that legacy. I'm going to try to emphasize what was good about it. I'm going to try to minimize what was not so good about it. And then I'm going to try to extend that legacy into the future. So extend it both just in terms of the timeline and the chronology, but also in terms of like the scope, the reach, the impact. And I think definitely that Henry IV to Henry V story, that's part of that. That's an element that you see there. So bearing that in mind, if we think about Lincoln and the Bardo, is it more of a Logan to Kendall type of a situation or more of a Henry IV to a Henry V type of a situation? I think I'm going to say that it is more of a Logan to Kendall situation. So what do I mean by that? I want to talk specifically about its relationship to one book in particular that I think it has maybe a self-conscious relationship to in the Western literary tradition. But if it's not self-conscious, it's certainly an implicit relationship to this book. And then the second book that it's got kind of another connection to too. There's some similarities. But before I do that, I want to talk about kind of like a Henry IV to a Henry V version of a successful passing of the torch in a literary tradition. And that the one that I have in mind is the relationship between the book Moby Dick and the book Blood Meridian. So Moby Dick is a incredibly awesome and impactful work. super influential if you read it and kind of are really able to kind of successfully get into it and experience it. It's one of those books that for a lot of people, it's really hard to not think about it for the rest of your life. It has a tendency to kind of color the way that you think and see the world for forever after you read it. It's a very successful novel. Complicated, difficult, yes, but also very successful, I think. Blood Meridian has, at some turns, a very, very aware relationship to Moby Dick, and then at other turns, kind of probably more of like a implicit, almost like spiritual connection to Moby Dick. But it engages with Moby Dick in a way kind of like Henry IV to Henry V, where it kind of like embodies the message, the spirit, the energy, and then extends it, and does all that in a way that is compelling and satisfying. So Blood Meridian is its own very successful work, but its relationship to that important, ancestor, great uncle, whatever, in Moby Dick, that relationship is also a successful one, where you have like a really interesting handoff, really interesting passing of the torch. It's even interesting to think of it as a passing of the torch, because that becomes that idea of like the keeping of the flame and the passing of the torch becomes its own theme in Cormac McCarthy's work as a whole. But also too, Moby Dick is its own version of a successful succession plan, because Moby Dick, among other things, is very connected both textually, spiritually, thematically to Shakespeare, and specifically to like King Lear and Hamlet. But that's another example of a really successful passing of the torch. So there's kind of like this lineage there, right? Those are some examples of some success there. But a spot where I think there is what looks like a family lineage, that would be from War and Peace to Lincoln and the Bardo. But I would say this is not a Moby Dick to Blood Meridian sort of a passing of the torch. This is an unsuccessful one. This is more like a Logan to Kendall Roy type of a passing of the torch. So why would I say that? I'll give you 3 areas where I think there are connections that make the two works related, but where the connection is also illustrative of the failure of Lincoln and the Bardo to be a successful successor. And so those 3 areas are worldview as thematic material, characterization, and then the formal aspects of the work, or the structure of the work. So worldview. First off, it is kind of a feather in the cap of Lincoln and the Bardo that Mr. Saunders decided to try to write a book that is so ambitious when it comes to tackling the kind of worldview issues that he's tackled. I mean, this is the stuff people have been talking about since the dawn of man. There's a lot that has been said about understanding who we are as human beings, what this universe is that we find ourselves in, what our relationship is to the universe, to each other, to some higher power. All of those things are big topics that even the most unthinking people find themselves spending a little time thinking about every once in a while. And lots of people who have tried really hard to make meaningful contributions to human thought and culture have spent a lot of time on that topic. And so, there is a very self-conscious entrance into that long and complicated conversation that Mr. Saunders is making. When I think about that vis-a-vis War and Peace, so if you're not familiar with War and Peace, that's also a book where there is like some really significant worldview stuff that's going on there as well, which everything Leo Tolstoy wrote is about that kind of stuff. What I would say though is that you get you get both practical depictions and some like philosophical reflections on this worldview stuff that are way more internally consistent. They're way more, there's more integrity to them. but also, and maybe most importantly, they say something new in War and Peace, and all of that happens in a way that I just did not get from Lincoln and the Bardo. I was actually super excited whenever I found out that this book is about kind of like the afterlife type stuff. And I was really interested. I didn't know that word Bardo going into my reading of the book. So whenever I looked it up and found out that it's, this kind of like, purgatory kind of liminal zone, this idea of that exists in Buddhism, I was like, ooh, so he intentionally picked a non-Western, non-Christian word, and he's going to be talking about this from like a time period in American history where, Eastern philosophy was definitely not like, the primary way that people understood themselves or their relationship to eternity. It sounds like maybe he's going to have some interesting stuff to say. And I just unfortunately did not find much that was new, that really like rung my bell in a significant way when it came to what we learned about the afterlife, or about meaning, about ontology, teleology, any of the big kind of issues. Like ontology meaning like the idea of like being. Why are we what we are? What's our purpose? Teleology meaning kind of the philosophical school of thought that's more about doing. What are we supposed to be about? Where are we going? What are we supposed to be doing with ourselves? How are we supposed to live? Just didn't get a whole lot there. What we did get was there's a lot of pathos, a lot of humanity, a lot of kind of like, this is part of what made life, sad sometimes, exciting sometimes, some celebration of some quotidian details of life that's cool, but not all that new, not something that I haven't seen in other places, heard in other places, and frankly, in some cases, heard in a way that was more compelling. So just didn't really get any like worldview stuff that really kind of like did it for me. And this is number one on my list, but I would say this is the biggest and most significant issue that I have with the book. So yeah, just didn't really get to, I didn't get any contributions to the way that I understand myself or the universe in a way that I would have hoped for when I found out what the subject material was. So then the second way that I think Lincoln and the Bardo falls a little bit short in its conversation with the literary tradition that it finds itself in, is it's in its approach to character. So I think that the most compelling character for me was Abraham Lincoln. But I didn't really get anything about him or from him that was new. And in fact, the main thing that I got was reminders of other stuff that I've learned about him in other places that I really liked and I thought was really interesting. But I thought that it reminded me of stuff that was, interesting, satisfying, fulfilling when I learned about it in other places. But I learned about it in other places that were more satisfying, more fulfilling, more interesting than the reminder that I got in Lincoln and the Bardo. This is a very complicated cast of characters that are presented to us in a very unconventional and potentially confusing way. And I don't really feel like that happened in a way where I was able to figure out how to connect emotionally on a consistent way with a lot of the characters that I met. I had moments when I felt like some of them felt very real. I felt like their thoughts they had like a roundness to them. They felt believable and human. But then I also had moments when they felt like set pieces. They felt like they were there. So yeah, we didn't get some of the traditional structural elements of dialogue that would tell us who was going to talk when. But what we had were some characters whose place in the conversation became the set piece that cued me so that I understood how to find my way through the dialogue. And that's not a very good way to introduce a character because it makes the character seem wooden. They seem like a cardboard cutout. And again, when that happens, even if it happens with just a couple of characters, if you start to feel like some of those characters feel a little false or a little flimsy, then the whole world can start to fall apart. And that was part of what happened for me. It was one of those things where there was like, it was interesting and kind of like this is a fun curiosity sort of a way, but it wasn't interesting in like a immersive sort of a way for me. And to connect this characterization issue with the worldview issue, if I'm going to be able to get into the kind of depth of thought required to really kind of like get down and into it on the worldview stuff, I can't be yanked back out of the experience of reading the book by kind of like hollow experiences with some of the characters. So if you compare that to, and I don't think I mentioned this about comparing the worldview piece with War and Peace to Lincoln and the Bardo. So War and Peace delivers a lot of like super super interesting, super meaty, super satisfying commentary on the worldview stuff. And it does it in a way by building its own worldview. The work itself has its own worldview and it comes into existence by in a way that's kind of similar in the book Brothers Karamazov, where you've got interlocutors who are sometimes it's characters, sometimes it's like thematic material or the action in the story, where you get like here's an idea, here's the antithesis to the idea, here's the idea again, here's the antithesis, and you kind of get swung back and forth. But it's part of how you build the ideas and the conclusions the book ultimately kind of drives you toward, is you get both sides of it. And just like in Brothers Karamazov, where you get done and you think, I'll say it this way, and this is, I'm not the only guy that said this, obviously lots of people have, but there are people who have atheistic, materialistic views of the world, and they think that they love Brothers Karamazov because they think it's the most cogent articulation of that way of thinking that's ever been written. And there are also people who have very theistic, very, kind of like there's a God, he's a personal being, he created everything, he's in control of everything. And they look at Brothers Karamazov and say, it's the most compelling presentation of that kind of a worldview. So people on both sides of that very contentious issue think of that book as being a really satisfying expression of the way they view the world. That's a great example of somebody who did something really wild and significant in the conversation about the worldview department. And again, I'm not saying Lincoln and the Bardo has to live up to that standard. It doesn't have to beat Brothers Karamazov. But if you're going to talk about worldview and you want to do it in a way that means something and says something, part of what you would have to aspire to do whenever you do that is to enter into that same conversation that Brothers Karamazov and War and Peace are a part of. And that conversation goes back a long way. It goes through things like Moby Dick, back to the Bible, through the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, through, whatever those materials are, all the way back to very early works. And there's moments in Lincoln and the Bardo where that happens very self-consciously. So like there's the way that he chooses to talk about some very materialistic things like sex, for example. He does it, Mr. Saunders does, I think intentionally, in Platonic terms. He's actually talking about Greek philosophy, using the same language of Greek philosophy to talk about some of the like funnier, aspects of some of the action, like the sex stuff. But he does it intentionally using Plato's language or Plato's style. So again, I think he's having an intentional conversation. It doesn't matter a lot if that conversation's intentional or not. You're having an unintentional conversation with this tradition, whether you like it or not, just because you decide you're going to talk about worldview. The question is, can you do it successfully or not? And for my money, it was not done successfully. So we got the fallen short on the worldview, characterization. So I kind of gave you my gripes about how some of the characters were maybe a little bit false, a little bit hollow. I didn't really kind of connect with them. If you compare that again to War and Peace has a famously huge cast. And there's also similar ambition in just picking the historical material, because it picks the Napoleonic Wars, and specifically it makes Napoleon a pretty major character in the story, along with is Kutuzov, I think is how you say it, the Russian general, who's also a historical character and who is very prominent in the story. but they're like real round characters, and then you have this huge cast of additional characters, and lots of them feel very, very real. They feel real enough that they almost feel like self-conscious and self-aware. Like Harold Bloom has famously talked about Prince Hamlet as being that way. He's able to kind of hear himself speak and then learn and change from that experience. And you get kind of like a similar sort of experience with some of the characters that we meet in War and Peace, especially like Alexei. And that's something to aspire to, and something that, like it or not, Lincoln in the Bardo was in conversation with, and I think doesn't execute in that conversation very well. And then the third area is form. It's kind of some of the formal choices. So, and a lot of people have talked about how Lincoln in the Bardo is very unique formally, and also very ambitious formally. Now, to go back to my previous examples of Moby Dick and Blood Meridian, those are some really unique and ambitious works in terms of their formality as well. And the form carries along the story and the themes of the story remarkably well. So like Moby Dick has some very self-consciously biblical aspects to its language. There's also the way that Moby Dick has like long kind of like scientific taxonomy of whale species. There's stuff like that, that's in the story. If you ask a lot of people too, how much of Moby Dick happens on land, they'd be like, oh gosh, I don't think very much of it happens on land at all. But if you go back and look at it, actually a really large part of the beginning of the book is kind of like getting you ready just to get on the ship, and then even, shipping onto the Pequod, and then what happens in town after that. That those formal decisions feed into the story in a way that makes it unique and memorable and moves it along. And then similarly, if you have any familiarity with Blood Meridian, you know about some of the decisions that were made. Again, biblical language, high biblical language, kind of more like King James type stuff. Incredibly poetic, dense language, long sentences, and then also some intentional decisions with punctuation. Like stuff like dropping the T from not contractions, dropping G's, not putting an apostrophe in its place, simple things like that keep your eye moving through the text. And that is, in a way, that it adds speed to the text, which helps you digest the density of the text. So those are all kind of like formal choices that affected the way you experience the work. I did not get that kind of like help in Lincoln in the Bardo from the incredibly complicated formal decisions that Mr. Saunders has made in the way that he wrote it. Now, it's non-conventional and it's pretentious, and pretension for me is not always bad. Moby Dick is super pretentious, but part of what makes it awesome is the pretension. And also too, Blood Meridian is the same way. Blood Meridian is crazy pretentious. In some ways, that's maybe one of the most pretentious things I've ever, not just pretentious books I've ever read, but like pretentious things I've ever consumed. It's like just as pretentious as like going to a nice restaurant that puts like gold shavings on top of your dish, like just because it's like pretentious to eat gold. Blood Meridian has aspects of it that are like that too. But the pretension has this kind of like, if you make the decision to be pretentious, you can kind of like get the pretension to pack a crazy punch. Like a good example of that is there's a lot of pretension in the Lord of the Rings stories, but the world is so immersive in part because of the pretension, So anyway, it's the most I've ever said that word in my life. So my purpose in saying that is just to say, I'm not trying to be critical by saying that Lincoln in the Bardo is pretentious. That's another way of saying it's ambitious. But you got to deliver on the pretension to make it worth it. And I did not feel like it was worth it. I felt like at moments the structural choice to have all these different voices that are talking in unconventional language about what it means to be dead, describing it like at turns that are, you know, funny, at other turns that are like sad, but in a bittersweet sort of a way. All the different kind of characters who have like these corresponding realities in their, you know, like in between world that they live in, and the way that they died and the place they were when they died. Some of that was like entertaining and funny, but didn't always really kind of like advance the thematic material in a way that was satisfying. And it's okay for stuff to be funny and not satisfying. There's lots of stuff that's like that. You know, knock jokes are like that. But if it can be funny and satisfying, that's the stick to your ribs stuff. That elevates something from being like, yeah, it was fun to read, to being like, whoo, that blew my mind. That one's gonna live in my brain for a little while. It might be one of those that I end up carrying with me for the rest of forever, you know? And there is an aspirational move toward that happens really just when you write a book, but especially if you write a book about Abraham Lincoln and death and the afterlife. You are aspiring to get into a really big, really long, really important conversation. And it's kind of like, you know, if you want to go talk politics at the grown-ups table, you know, you're going to need to have something meaningful to say, to not be like patted on the head, you know. And again, I don't want to be too heavy on Mr. Saunders because, like, you know, there's a lot about this book that I admire, you know. But what I would say is that the aspiration to step into this conversation, I admire the aspiration, but I don't think he did it. You know, I am going to be interested to read some of his other stuff. I've heard from some of my friends that his short stories are super compelling. And I do think that, like, a guy that's got this kind of like chutzpah to try to kind of bite off what he bit off in this book, it makes me hopeful that he's done it and done it with success in some of his other stuff. So I'll be excited to check that out. But for me, at the end of the day, I think my verdict on Lincoln and the Bardo is ambitiously try to enter into a conversation where it was not able to successfully hang.